Welcome to Civics and Coffee, a history podcast, the show all about United States history, delivered to you in the time it takes to enjoy your morning cup of coffee. I'm your host, Alicia, a historian trained in United States history with a passion for telling both the known and unknown parts of America's past. So grab your coffee and get ready for some bite-sized history. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you all had a restful and happy holiday. I am so pleased to end the year with yet another book exploring the American Revolution. With the 250th anniversary of the Revolution's beginnings next year, I am excited to see how scholars offer fresh perspectives on an era many of us think we know. Dr. Richard Bell is a historian and an author whose work challenges traditional narratives of the American Revolution. His book, The American Revolution and the Fate of the World, presents a transnational perspective that reveals the revolution as a global conflict intertwined with various international events. I hope you all enjoy the conversation. Hello, everyone. Joining me today is Dr. Richard Bell. He is a professor of history at the University of Maryland and has been an Andrew Carnegie Fellow. He is the author of The American Revolution and the Fate of the World, which will be the focus of our conversation today. Welcome, Dr. Bell.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. Let's dive right on into this incredible book. You frame your analysis of the American Revolution in a transnational lens. What motivated this line of inquiry, and how does this challenge existing narratives?
Great question. Thanks. There's a couple of ways to answer that, I guess. One would be to say that we live in a transnational world today. It's hard not to notice the effects of, globalization, for instance, migration across the world today. And to imagine that all began, in 1985 or something, is to put a false sort of beginning to what's actually a centuries-long period of global entanglement. And the 18th century was no exception to that. And then I also am deeply aware that over the last 20 years, there's been a flowering of academic scholarship, some of it quite niche, in different subfields, which each individually expose one sort of transnational connection or another with the American Revolution. And so my goal was to sort of pull all these strands together and make them talk to each other. So people who write about the role of, German soldiers in the war aren't normally the same people who write about native actors in the war, right? Or the effects on convicts and in going to Australia. So I'm bringing all these different sort of literatures together, wrapping my arms around them, squeezing them tight, and trying to say something bold, original, and new about the American Revolution, a conflict we already think we know, but it turns out it's way more interesting.
Yeah. And one of the, I think, bolder arguments that you're making is that the American Revolution was really, truly a world war. And so, in what ways was the revolution a world war?
Well, how long have you got, right? Uh, in every meaningful way, right? I'm not saying it's the First World War. I'm not saying it's the last World War. I'm saying it is a global conflict, right? So we can see conflict, struggle, fighting in battles, etc., almost everywhere. And think not just of the I-95 Acela corridor on the East Coast from Boston to what is now Washington, D.C., a corridor I know well, by the way, because I live in Maryland. But think about, first of all, the rest of the North American continent. We know that the area west of Appalachia, the Trans-Appalachian West, was actually the largest battlefront, about 1,000 miles from end to end. This is Native America. We used to call it Indian country. It's the same thing. Think about Canada. Think about the Caribbean. Think about Florida. Major fighting in Florida, not one of the 13 rebel colonies, but it's a pair of colonies. Britain actually loses to Spain during the war. And this is all just on North American mainland so far. Now add in Jamaica, add in Martinique and Guadeloupe, add in Nicaragua, Belize, Honduras in Central America. We could talk about revolts against the Spanish Empire in Peru and Colombia and Venezuela, which are triggered by the American Revolution in meaningful ways. And then if we break outside of the Americas, we can just keep going. We can talk about the invasion of Britain by France and Spain in 1779. We can talk about insurrection in Ireland in the middle of the American Revolution and later as well. We can talk about the longest siege of the American Revolutionary War, which was in Gibraltar, which is a rocky promontory off Spain's southern tip. It's the longest siege of the war, one of the bloodiest and most sort of high casualty events of the whole war. We can talk about what happens in Senegal and Cape Verde and Cape Town and Ceylon. Do you see me moving around into the Indian Ocean here? We can talk about Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta. We can talk about the Kingdom of Mysore. We can even talk, of course, about the role of Chinese tea from the Fujian Mountains, right, which ends up on British East India Company ships headed to Boston. We can talk about the rise of Australia as an alternate penal colony once Britain can no longer send its convicted felons to Maryland, where I live now, which is where they used to dump most of them before the revolution. So if you looked at that on a map, you'd see a lot of pins in a lot of places. I'm not saying every square foot on Earth is seas, fighting, but I am saying enough of the Earth and enough of the world's oceans see conflict and conflagration and consequences, but it makes sense to think of it as a world war in all but name.
Well, and I think that argument and that scope is just so broad, and I like what you do because you tell this story through the lived experiences of those who were involved in the revolution. And so how does this deepen our understanding of the war's scope and its impact?
I love that question because, yes, I think, you can get lost in sort of numbers and battles if you fly at 35,000 feet right over this global war, which is it's tempting to do given how sort of continent crossing and ocean spanning it is. But that's not the kind of history I like to read, and it's not the kind of history I want to write either. So this is, in many ways, a sort of bottom-up history of the global dimensions of the American Revolution. Five of the chapters, there are 14 chapters in this book, each of them are quite short. Five of the chapters take one person and use that person's experiences as a lens into a larger community or phenomenon. So we follow one American loyalist bouncing around out of revolutionary America, ending up in London, then in Canada, trying to get to India after the war. She's the wife of Benedict Arnold. She's a pretty fascinating figure. We follow one Indigenous woman whose name is Molly Brant. She is a member of the Mohawk, the Haudenosaunee people, and she tries to hold the British Iroquois alliance together, but ends up as a refugee of war, struggling for survival in the Trans-Appalachian West. We follow a Patriot school teacher who decides to join a Patriot privateering mission. Privateers are basically like Patriot-sponsored pirates and goes all around the Atlantic Rim and gets captured, not once but twice, and ends up in two very different black sites or British detention centers around the Atlantic Rim. We follow people who end up in Australia, who end up in West Africa, including a former enslaved person once belonging to George Washington, who makes it away from George and ends up in the British Empire in Sierra Leone after the war. His name is Harry Washington. Someone should make a movie about him because it's such an amazing story. So I like human stories, right? That's how I respond as a reader. So I tried to write a book that I would want to read and putting people at the center of the narrative.
And I think the other thing that I thought was so wonderfully done is you talk about the role of the press in supporting the war effort and the all the troubles and the pluses and the minuses that came with it. So kind of what were their role and how accurate were they in capturing public sentiment?
This puts a finger on a really important theme. One of the things this book does quite frequently is sort of busting, right? Sort of challenging the sort of pop culture version of the American Revolution and saying, you know what, it's more interesting, it's more complicated, let's take another look. And one example of that is the myth of unanimity, the manufactured myth which we've all participated in over the last 250 years. And I say we there because despite this silly British accent, I'm a US citizen. And the myth of unanimity is the idea that we were all patriots back then, right? That everyone in America was a patriot. And that is nonsense, 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 right? This was, in fact, the first American Civil War. It was a war between Americans, between loyalists and patriots, and the people in the middle, the neutrals, the undecideds. Today we call them swing voters or something like that. The people who hadn't made up their minds or want to tell you how their mind was made up. And so what that means is, because it's a war among Americans as well as a war between Americans and people around the world, there is a bitter battle for hearts and minds within the 13 rebel colonies. And you can see that in the newspapers, you can see that in the political pamphlets. There's a really vibrant, for lack of a better word, debate, I would say shouting match probably, shouting match in the colonial revolutionary press here. And there are plenty of loyalist newspaper editors and pamphleteers trying to make the case that sticking with Britain is ultimately to the benefit of the American colonists. Yes, Britain is treating us badly, but that doesn't mean we should set our own house on fire as a way to send a signal. Surely there is a path to reconciliation or reparation. Surely Britain can be made to see that it can treat us better. And they are up against, on the Patriot side, on the pro-independence side, some of the most skillful writers this continent has ever produced. I'm thinking of Paul Revere, I'm thinking of Samuel Adams, and most of all, my fellow former English expat, Thomas Paine, who moved from England to Philadelphia in 1774 and became the booster, cheerleader, if you want, of the independence cause. And his argument, or at least the way he framed the arguments for independence, to try to persuade neutrals, maybe even loyalists, to change allegiance, are incredibly powerful. And if folks haven't read Common Sense, its major masterwork since high school, go and read it. It's as relevant now as it ever was, and it will really catch you with its sort of chatty, let me tell you sort of language.
That's an excellent idea, and one of the things is kind of speaking on the tipping the scales and driving emotions is this idea of the quote unquote tyranny of King George. And so how did this American perception of the tyranny of King George kind of differ from the actual political reality?
So you know what? If you watch the musical Hamilton, Alicia, and it's been around for 10 years, everyone's seen it at this point, right? I've seen it lots of times. I'm generally a fan. If you watch the musical Hamilton, the king comes on two or three times during the show, and he's a bit of a nutter, right? He's a bit of a psychopath, right? He smiles at you a lot, but in a sort of creepy way, and he says, "I'm going to kill your friends and family to remind you of my love," right? He's a psychopath, right? A tyrant, an unpredictable despot, and that view that Lin-Manuel Miranda puts across of King George is the exact same view you see in Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, right? The king is an out of control tyrant who's enacted and is enacting an intentional program of harm. If you read the body of the declaration, it's a list of 27 grievances against Britain, but they're actually 27 grievances against King George. He has done this. He has done that. He has done the other thing 27 times. So we take from Jefferson, and certainly I think Lin-Manuel Miranda did, the idea that the king is the enemy here, and he's trying to, and has long been trying to strangle the American colonists. And you get the view that he's not a very nice man, actually. And up against that, we could put the recent access that scholars have had to the king's own private papers. Queen Elizabeth II, our late queen, as a British person, I have to say our late queen, Queen Elizabeth II, she granted scholars access to King George's papers for the first time in history about 20 years ago. And as a result, we've seen over the last 20 years a flowering of scholarship based on those papers. And it's fundamentally changed our view of who King George actually was. That maybe, just maybe, Alicia, we shouldn't believe all propaganda put out by patriots who wanted to challenge him, right? It turns out that in many ways, he was a very middle of the road, you might even say mediocre British leader, not prone to aggression, not prone to using force as his preferred tool of political power, often somewhat of a conciliator who kept in mind the oath he'd sworn to protect the British Empire and its unwritten constitution. So we have that view, by the way, there's a recent book called The Last King of America by the great biographer Andrew Roberts, if people want to read that for themselves. So we put these two views up against each other, and we struggle to find out, where the truth is. And this is where I should remind folks that King George is not the same person in 1765 as he is in 1775 or 1785. That, like many leaders, especially in wartime, he changes his mind. So up until about 1773, up until about the Boston Tea Party, he is a voice of reason within British politics, telling his bungling prime ministers, what the bloody hell are you doing? Are you sure this new tax hike is a good idea? Don't you think that's going to annoy them? Don't you think that's going to blow up in their faces? And they say, oh, don't worry, Georgie boy, we've got this, we're smarter than you. And they're wrong, 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 right? Think of the Stamp Act, think of the Townshend duty. When the Tea Party comes around and 100, Bostonians toss massive amounts of private property belonging to the East India Company into Boston Harbor to protest the Tea Act, King George says, oh, dear Lord, maybe I've been too lenient. Maybe I've been too flexible. Maybe these people were just as bad as my ministers were telling me these last 10 years. Why are they so ungrateful? We need to send them a message. And so that's the moment, Alicia, the Tea Party, when King George does actually embrace, for lack of a better word, belligerence as a strategy there. He does start to seek obedience and loyalty more aggressively in the wake of the Boston Tea Party. And then when the war begins at Lexington and Concord in 1775, and when shots are fired, he takes the view that it must be submission or else, that there's no path to reconciliation, there's no path to a ceasefire, a halfway deal where maybe we give them some of the stuff they want. He needs submission because his own reputation in Europe, in front of Spain, in front of France, is at stake. Is he going to look weak in front of his rivals? He can't afford that. So he does double down on winning the war and therefore on stubbornness in a way that I think costs a lot of lives, both on the British side, on the Patriot side as well. So all I'm saying in summary here is he's way more complicated than an out of control psychopath.
Well said. Now, you made mention about this earlier that the book is really a series of kind of myth busting ideas. You're taking these ideas and you're really kind of tearing them apart and making us really reconsider what we thought we knew. And so, what did we get wrong about George Washington's actions during the Battle of Trenton?
Battle of Trenton, December 1776. Let's set the scene here for folks. Washington doesn't win many battles early in the war. We think of him as the victor in the war because he is the victor in the war, right? He does win one very climactic battle, the Battle of Yorktown at the end of the war. There are also a few other victories we should note like Saratoga as well. But in 1775 and 6 and 7, he is losing way more battles than he's winning. In fact, he's largely on the run, sort of retreating, trying not to get cornered or captured by the advancing and swelling British army, which has been augmented by German soldiers known as Hessians, who King George has rented en masse to help him sort of squash this rebellion. So George is in dire straits, George Washington, that is, in the fall of 1776. He's down to about, thanks to so many desertions, he's down to about 5,000 men, and he's up against a combined British and Hessian force north of 20,000. It might be 30,000 at the time. So you wouldn't like those odds, I don't think. And yet, he does two things which are really important. Number one is he doesn't surrender. He doesn't get cornered. He doesn't capitulate. He stays in it, which is essential to the future that will eventually occur. And number two, he stages whenever he can counterattacks, right? When he thinks he has a shot. And one of those strategic counterattacks is the Battle of Trenton, in Trenton, New Jersey, in December 1776. And the story goes that Washington crosses the Delaware secretly at night. You've all seen this picture. The picture you've all seen bears no relation to what actually happened, but it's a great painting. And he sneaks up on Trenton and surprises the sleeping Hessians while they're all asleep and hungover after a Christmas party. Not really. Not really. The Hessians are not quite that naive or ill-prepared, right? They're led by some very sensible commanders. Johann Rall is in charge. He's already beaten Washington once at Fort Washington in New York a few months earlier, and he's stationed troops around Trenton to sound the alarm on the day after Christmas if there is going to be any sort of surprise attack. But those sentries, those lookouts, who may or may not be hungover, they really are not expecting much action that day because there's a bitter, swirling snowstorm that night, the night after Christmas. And so fundamentally, Rawl thinks, okay, this is a precaution, putting out these sentries, keeping a third of my troops on alert in case there's an attack, but there won't actually be an attack because who in their right mind would attack us in the middle of a snowstorm? And George Washington says, look behind you, it's me. Um, and he does gain, some degree of the element of surprise. And certainly by the time all the other Hessian troops, wake up and put on their uniforms, there is a sense that they've missed the ability to really push back this attack. So we see a lot of hand-to-hand combat, which is very rare in the war. At the Battle of Trenton, we see George Washington surrounding Trenton, New Jersey on three sides, raining down artillery into the town. And the victory that Washington achieves at the Battle of Trenton, I think, has symbolic significance. It's a huge morale boost to an army and a patriot civilian population that has been used to losing or retreating for the last 6 months. And it leads to the capture of 1,000 Hessian warfighters. They're taken off the battlefield by Washington's victory at Trenton, and then he launches a bizarre scheme to try to get them to flip to the Patriots, which I talk about in the book as well.
Well, and one of the things I loved about this book is that I felt like I was learning something new on every single page. And so in that vein, can you talk a little bit about Spain's involvement in the American Revolution? And I think maybe more importantly, why this isn't a larger part of the story that we know about the revolution?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, I certainly feel there's a lot of revelations in this book that demand our attention here, right? This is not, the familiar story of the American Revolution, even though all the tentpole events are in this book, right? The Battle of Yorktown, I talk about three different times in this chapter, in this book, but I approach the Battle of Yorktown, for instance, through the French perspective, through the Hessian perspective, through the perspective of Black refugees as well, not the usual sort of Washington on the March perspective. Spain is one of those topics, right? If we're lucky, we know that France played a role in the war, or we know who Lafayette was, but we rarely give a thought to the Patriots' most tenacious ally and the biggest thorn in King George's side after George Washington, and that is the Spanish government. The Spanish government wades into the war in 1779. I'll say a bit more about that in a second. Before it officially gets in, it's funneling guns and ammo through Spanish New Orleans and Spanish Havana onto the battlefields of North America to prop up this insurgency within the British Empire, because there's nothing the King of Spain likes more than watching the British Empire eat itself alive, right? And fight itself to death. This is like Christmas for the kings of Europe who are not King George. So when Spain eventually officially joined the war in 1779, my God, the things it does. The Spanish prime minister, a very cunning guy called Floridablanca, decides that the best way to cripple King George is to send troops and sailors and ships to all the places King George is not ready to defend. He's focused on North America, of course. So Floridablanca tries to invade southern Britain, sends a second Spanish armada after the one 200 years earlier to try to invade southern Britain. He stages the longest siege of the entire war against British Gibraltar, the rocky outcrop at Spain's southern tip, which Spain would dearly like to reclaim. He sends troops against the British in British Honduras and Nicaragua. He sends the Spanish Navy, which is very powerful, against Jamaica and other British Caribbean possessions. And he has a guy on the ground in Spanish New Orleans called Galvez, Bernardo de Galvez, who is as formidable opponent of King George III as George Washington is. And Galvez just marches into British West Florida, takes it, even though British West Florida was not rebelling. Britain loses that colony. to Spain. East Florida, which is the peninsula, comes with it. And one of the most climactic battles of the American Revolution, a battle that actually sets up the loss of Yorktown, is Galvez's siege of Pensacola, Florida, which Britain has to work hard to hold on to and still fails. So all of these things are connected, Alicia, right? I'm not talking about separate theaters which don't matter. They all matter. My book cover has an image of sort of dominoes falling, right? One domino falls in Florida, that leads to Yorktown falling. Yorktown falling leads to other things falling, right? They're all connected on the global scale.
And so, talking about kind of the global scale, what are some of the international legacies of the American Revolution?
Yeah, international legacies. There are many. I'm going to pick maybe two because we could go on for a long time here. I'll pick the indigenous legacy and the legacy in South Asia, maybe. The indigenous legacy is, I think, generally pretty dark and catastrophic. Indigenous peoples are major actors in the war. I devote one chapter to their struggles. They are hoping that by siding largely with the British against the Patriots, they can hold back white American settlers from pushing ever further onto native lands west of Appalachia. They think the king might do something to stop them, build a wall to stop his settlers pushing beyond Appalachia. That's the promise of the alliance that indigenous people form with the king. The king loses the war, however, right? So he can't do much to help them. The king leaves, British troops leave. That means the king's allies, indigenous allies, are stuck fighting the US after independence without foreign assistance from the British Empire. And that puts them in a very difficult position, as you can imagine. Many are forced to abandon their ancestral lands, retreat, for lack of a better word, to British Canada. Others continue to fight and struggle and refuse to be dispossessed. So there's a real consequence for indigenous people as one of the foreign policy sort of legacies of the British loss of the colonies. Indigenous people lose their greatest European ally. Let's go down to the other side of the world, about 12,000 miles in a different direction. Let's talk about South Asia. Let's talk about India. Britain had been a relatively minor presence in India before the revolution. It had three trading posts via the British East India Company in Madras and Bombay and Calcutta, and I'm using their 18th century names, of course. And it almost lost each one of those to either the French Empire, which was expanding in India, or to indigenous princes. Think of the kingdom of Mysore, which is run by a Muslim prince named Hyder Ali. Hyder Ali uses the occasion of the American Revolution to try to push the British East India Company back into the sea, to remove their three toeholds from India, and almost succeeds. And it's really a dint of fate, or when the American Revolution ends, that causes Idar to be unsuccessful in that regard. Idar, by the way, also dies, and his son takes over the job. So when the American Revolution ends, there is a lot of second guessing in London about what this all means. We just lost 13 colonies to the Patriots. We lost the Floridas to Spain. We've lost a few other places around the world too. Why are we in this? Should we keep doing this? Should we keep trying to expand our empire and put our flag everywhere? What about the colonies we still have, like Madras and Bombay and Calcutta? Is it worth it to keep holding on to those things? And that second guessing, I think, really reveals real anxieties about the future of the British Empire. And for better or worse, I would say largely for worse, Britain eventually silences those doubters, and other people in positions of political power, like the Prime Minister, William Pitt, say, no, 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 we should keep going. We should keep going. We should hold the line in India. We should send more troops to India so that those three colonies, Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta, so they don't end up like Massachusetts and South Carolina and secede eventually. So he fills them up with troops to protect them from leaving the British Empire or being swarmed by the French or by the Mysoreans. And so many troops arrive in British India that something unforeseen happens, which is Britain suddenly has more troops than France and more troops than Mysore, and is actually able to expand British possessions, which had not been the plan after the war. It had just been to hold on. And a guy called Cornwallis, who I think many of your listeners may be familiar with, the great loser at the Battle of Yorktown, he's the one sent to India to enact this new policy of holding the line or maybe even expanding the British footprint in India. So what I'm saying in my long-winded way, Alicia, is the British Empire not only lives to fight another day after the loss of 13 colonies, it actually expands its footprint globally and significantly after the war. It sort of redoubles its efforts in the East, having sort of failed so dismally in the West. And that's a perspective we should keep in mind.
And it's kind of taking a step back for a moment. What do you hope readers take away from your book?
All those things and more, right? So I hope that readers take away from my book the idea that situating the American Revolutionary War in a global context is something our patriot leaders, George Washington and Benjamin Franklin, wanted to do and worked to do and succeeded in doing. The part of patriot strategy is to make this a global war, right? Because if it's just patriots versus loyalists and versus the Royal Navy, the most powerful military force in the history of the world, the Patriots are going to lose. Washington knows that and says that. Franklin knows that and says that. John Adams knows that and says that. They want to make this a very chaotic, distracting global struggle where Britain is forced to send troops and soldiers and sailors and ships in every possible direction, only one of which is North America. If they can do that, then the North American resistance has a chance of succeeding. So think about, why they send Franklin to France, why John Adams is drawing up a model treaty in July of 1776, why they send John Jay to Spain, why they're cultivating relations with Idar Ali in the kingdom of Mysore, 12,000 miles away, why they name a ship after him in Philadelphia in 1782. So this is not me imposing some sort of globalist agenda on the study of the American Revolution. If you're looking for a globalizing agenda, go read the papers of Ben Franklin, John Adams, and George Washington. This is what the war they want to fight because it's the war they can actually win. So I'm sort of challenging myths.
And I think when people finish this book, they're going to want to learn more about you and your scholarship. So, where should they go when they've finished this excellent book and they want to learn more about you?
Thank you. I'm a professor at the University of Maryland, where I teach every semester. I love my job. I have a website, which is www.richard-bell.com. I try and update that with regular events. I'm doing a lot of speaking about the book in public at the moment, including at libraries and bars as well, and everywhere in between. What else to say? I give lots of talks about other topics on various platforms like Smithsonian Associates. I'm sure many of your listeners are members of Smithsonian Associates, the nationwide members group. I also do a lot of work with lifelong learners, especially different chapters of the OSHA Lifelong Learning Institute across the country. I work with an organization called Profs and Pints, which is exactly what it sounds like. It sends professors into bars to give talks to people who are having a drink, and that is a wild experience. And I get to do that all over the country, especially in the Washington area. So I hope if people will remember my name, Richard Bell, and look me up, they'll find me doing all sorts of things, hopefully in their neck of the woods, as Al Roker likes to say.
Lovely. Well, we'll make sure to put the website in the show notes of this episode.
Thank
And
you.
so, before I let you go, is there anything that we haven't covered today that you really, really want future readers to know?
Oh, geez. I will just tell you a little anecdote about myself, maybe. I hope that's not too self-serving. I do have a British accent. That's because I'm actually British. This is not a fake British accent. I can't do accents. And so, I grew up in Britain in the 1980s and 1990s, not knowing any of this, Alicia. It's not like I got a slanted pro-British view of the American Revolution, like we called it the War of American Aggression or anything silly like that. I was taught absolutely nothing about American history when I went through K-12 in Britain, perhaps for obvious reasons that Britain didn't want to talk about any part of American history. Instead, the national curriculum back then, thank God it's changed a bit since then, told British school children some fairly comforting, self-serving stories about the Tudors fighting Catholic France and Catholic Spain and the Catholic Pope to create Protestant Britain. And then we jumped forward to World War II, where plucky Protestants led by Churchill fought the Nazis single-handedly, Alicia, single-handedly. Did you know that? So what I'm saying, right, is that, it turns out every nation tells its young people, especially in public settings, pop culture settings, very selective, narrow, nationalist myths about their own nation's path. And those myths are there to be challenged, I think, by professional historians who can offer something, I hope, more interesting, more nuanced, more complex, and hopefully revelatory as well. So even though we've all drank deep in those mythological stories, we shouldn't cling to them, right? We should be willing to interrogate them and find out what's true and what's not true and what's more interesting instead. So that's what I do as an historian, and that's what I've done in this book, The American Revolution and the Fate.
And quite well, I might add.
Thank
So
you.
to all the listeners out there, be sure to pick up a copy of The American Revolution and the Fate of the World. It is an incredible book that really forces readers to reconsider what they thought they knew about the revolution and its impacts throughout the world. Thank you again, Dr. Bell.
My pleasure.
My thanks again to Dr. Bell for spending time with me. Should you have any interest in the revolution and its impact around the world, then be sure to pick yourself up a copy of The American Revolution and the Fate of the World. Thanks, peeps. I'll see you next time. Thanks for sitting down with me as I explored this chapter of American history. If you liked what you heard, be sure to subscribe and share with your friends. I look forward to our next cup of coffee together.